Okay, so we're going to finish up John chapter 2, and how about this? How about we start with reading it, since we don't have a scripture reading? John chapter 2, starting in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So there are just a couple things that I want to note before we jump into this story. You'll call these introduction notes, I think. First of all, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to notice in verse 13, it says the Passover of the Jews was at hand. There's going to be 3 different times in the Gospel of John that you see the Passover. And I don't know which one of those we're going to spend the time talking about how Jesus redefines what the Passover is, but it's not this one. But the 3 different times that you see the Passover in the Gospel of John is the reason why people will say that Jesus had a ministry that lasted for 3 years. That's the reason. How do you know that Jesus' ministry lasted for 3 years, or approximately 3 years? Because there's 3 Passovers recorded in the Gospel of John, and that would take at least 2, up to 3 different years. And so there's that. Also, I want you to take note in verse 13 that it says, the Passover of the Jews. This is what the enemies of Jesus are doing. In the Gospel of John, the Jews are not the good guy. And so you'll see it again. What is it? Verse 18. So the Jews said to him, that's a technical term in the Gospel of John that means probably the leadership class, but definitely those who are opposed to Jesus. And so Jesus comes to Jerusalem. It's Passover, but specifically he walks into a setting. This is the reason why we talked about this. I want you to see. He walks into a setting that is the Passover of the Jews. And what that says to us in the Gospel of John is Jesus has stepped into hostile territory. He is in the presence of his enemies on one of their high holy days. And so that kind of sets the stage for what we're talking about. I also want to say this to you, just because it seems like it's not like there's anything productive that's going to come from this, but I think it's something that you should know. Do you notice that in the Gospel of John, this story of Jesus cleansing the temple is happening at the start of the ministry of Jesus? That's different from the Synoptic Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus rides into Jerusalem, and he goes to the temple, and then he cleans out the temple. And that's right before he's arrested at the end of his ministry. And so there is a question about this, and I don't really know the answer to this question. I'm not sure that I even have any good thoughts about these questions, but so the question is, did Jesus do this twice? Once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end of his ministry. And John recorded the one at the beginning, and the Synoptics recorded the one at the end. And it wouldn't be out of line, I don't think, to take that, especially since one of the things that we said about the Gospel of John, every single bit of the material in John 2, 3, and 4 is only in John. It's not in the Synoptic Gospels. So like the Samaritan woman at the well, the story of Jesus and Nicodemus, not in the Synoptic Gospels. And so if Jesus did this at the beginning of his ministry, it would fit really good here in a place that's not recorded in the Synoptics. And so maybe he did it twice. I don't know. Or maybe he did it once, and I would tend to think at the end of his ministry when the Synoptic writers are writing. But John takes that story. We kind of talked about this a little bit, about how the gospel writers are not interested in telling a chronological story. First he went here and did this, and then he went here and did this. Maybe John is taking that story and putting it in this block of text because he's making this point that we mentioned about this morning, where all of these stories all together tell a story about out with the old and in with the new. And what better way to make that point than Jesus walking into the temple saying, we got to clean this place out. And so it would be a perfectly reasonable thing, I think, to say that Jesus really did it at the end of his ministry, but John is just recording it here at the beginning of his ministry. I don't know that it really matters, but I at least want you to know that it's an issue. And also, especially for our young people, this is what I want you to know. It used to be that you would read about this in books critical of the Bible. But now you're going to see it on TikTok and Instagram all over the place. You're going to find some smarty who says something like, see, the Bible contradicts itself. John said it happened at the beginning. And the synoptics say that it happened at the end. And so looky there. The Bible contradicts itself. And I always think when I see these things, you can't come up with any explanation for this. Like, there's an explanation. I don't know what the explanation is, but there is an easy explanation to this situation. It does not have to be that the Bible contradicts itself. It doesn't worry me at all. Okay, so let's read about, sorry about that. Everything that I just said on one slide. Okay. Sorry, I don't know where my clicks are on this one. Let's get into the problem. Verse 14. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. So let's talk about the problem. Let's get a sense of what's going on here and why it's wrong. I think this is worth paying attention to. So imagine that you are a Jewish person traveling to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when you get to Jerusalem for the Passover, especially the Passover, remember the thing about a Passover lamb? You have to sacrifice the Passover lamb. What if you're coming from like Ephesus? Are you just going to put your lamb on a rope and like, we're going to hop on this boat or walk all the way to Ephesus with your lamb? Or even farther. Or this seems reasonable. I don't think that this is necessarily something to be critical of. Or you could just buy one when you get to Jerusalem. I've got my money. I've got all of this stuff saved for this purpose. I'm going to do what God told me to do and sacrifice the lamb. But instead of bringing this thing halfway across the ancient world, I'll just buy one when I get there. And so your sacrifices, the pigeons and the lambs and all of the things to sacrifice, that's what you're seeing here. And here's another thing we're thinking about. Awads, you guys travel overseas all the time. Do you spend American money in other places? Like, I don't know where you were. You just hand out dollars? People accept dollars and everywhere?
Preferred it.
Yeah. Well, when I went to India, I couldn't spend my dollars. At the airport, I had to say, hey, here's my dollars. And they would give me rupees. I think that's what it was, rupees at the time. And it's not like, here's $5, give me the equivalent of that many rupees. It was, thank you for your $5. We're going to charge you some money to make this trade, and minus that money that we charged you, here's the money that you can spend in India now. And the same thing is true. Like, you're traveling to Jerusalem, you're going to pay your temple tax, you're going to buy your sacrifices, but you've got your money from your local place where you live, and you show up, and you got two different things happening here in the temple. You got Jesus walks into the temple, the place where you're supposed to go to worship God, and he sees people selling animals to sacrifice, which is a reasonable thing to think is going to happen, but not in the temple. He walks into the temple and you see a marketplace set up. Oh yeah, and if you want to buy one of these animals to sacrifice, you got to change some money, and that's also going to cost you. And we're going to make some money off of that. Jesus tells us the specific problem. This is the thing that you should take notice of in this. In verse 16, he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." People have come here to worship God, and you set up a marketplace so that you could make a buck in this place. And Jesus looks around at this situation. Look at this. I thought this quote was really worth sharing to you in this. Instead of solemn dignity and the murmur of prayer, there is the bellowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. Instead of the brokenness and contrition, holy adoration and prolonged petition, there's noisy commerce. So you go to the place where people go to worship God, and you hear people saying, "Buy my sheep, buy my pigeon. Oh, you want to buy my pigeon? That's going to cost you too." And everybody's there to make a buck. And you can see some stuff like this in some different places in the Bible. Look at Nehemiah chapter 13. I am sorry if you've already done this. If you haven't, stick your finger in John 2, because we're going to come back to John chapter 2. But then turn over to Nehemiah chapter 13. And I don't want you to just be thinking about history or what we're reading about in the Gospels. I want you to start to kind of imagine in your head how a situation like this might teach us something, or how something like this might apply to us. Nehemiah 13, let's start in verse 15, and I'm going to read, it's longer, I'm going to read down to verse 22. Nehemiah 13, starting in verse 15. "In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day." You got that? This is the day that's supposed to be dedicated to service and worship to God. And Nehemiah says, I look around and all I see is a bunch of people trying to make money on the day that's dedicated to service and devotion to God. He says, "And I warned them on the day when they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself." There's an exclamation mark. The people of Judah. Even in Jerusalem, where the temple is, the place where we're supposed to go and worship God, everybody's just trying to make a buck on the Sabbath in Jerusalem. "And then I confronted the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, 'What is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you're bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath.'" Verse 19, "As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. And then the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice." Get this picture. Nehemiah says, we're not going to do this on the Sabbath. This is the day when we come to worship God. And so he shuts the gates and he says, "No, you're not going to come in here and do this on the Sabbath." And so they're like, fine. So they just set up their stuff right outside the gates. So as soon as the doors open, we can just run into Jerusalem and make some more money. And Nehemiah says, "What are you guys doing?" In verse 20, The merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice, but I warned them and I said to them, this is probably, Adam, remember when you were teaching this class? This is probably one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. I need to get a background on my phone that says this. Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. That's what it needs to say on my computer background. If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. I think there's a great principle here. There's a principle that you see in John chapter 2 when Jesus walks into the temple. You see it in Nehemiah chapter 13 about people who are distracted by other things. Specifically, they're distracted by their making money and how they might get ahead. And they've taken that stuff that they're distracted by and they've set God kind of off in the corner. You know, oh, this is the place where we're going to go and worship God, but also it's the place where we're going to go and make money. Oh, hey, Jerusalem, the Sabbath is a day devoted to God, but also it's a day when I can make money and sell my stuff and all of these things. Look at Malachi chapter 2. I think this one might apply also. In Malachi chapter 2, this is where we were earlier when we read about the John the Baptist passage. You will recognize this, and it kind of makes me think, since we've already read from Malachi 2 and the John the Baptist stuff from John chapter 1, it kind of makes me think that this might be what we're supposed to be thinking of. We're in the same vicinity here. Malachi chapter 2, verse 17. I'm going to read down to chapter 3 and verse 4. You have wearied the Lord with your words. So this is the way that Malachi works. You've done this. And then in Malachi, you've got a bunch of mouthy people who shoot back, who say, how have we done that? And then he explains. But you say, how have we wearied him? And then this is the answer. By saying, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or by asking, where is the justice of God? That's what the people have done. Malachi's coming to them, and these people are saying, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you do evil, it's really good. And where's God's justice? God's not going to do anything about this. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. That should sound familiar. That's the John the Baptist passage. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in the former years. So the John the Baptist passage says, you are not right. And John the Baptist is going to come and he's going to prepare the way. And the very next thing that's going to happen after that is the Lord himself will walk onto the scene and he's going to refine the situation. He's going to clean this mess out, which I think is a reference to what we're talking about here in John chapter 2. Jesus' ministry starts. The water to wine story is Jesus saying, God's messianic banquet has arrived, and the very first thing that needs to happen is we got to clean this mess out. You all have messed this thing up. We got to clean this stuff out. You've made this a marketplace instead of a place where people go to worship God. So let's stop here for just 1 second and think about this. I've got 2 things maybe for you to consider. Number 1, in just a minute we're going to talk about how the temple that Jesus is building that we need to do some housekeeping on is ourselves, our body. Ryan, I'm not talking about the church. I'm talking about me. We are the temple of God. We'll read about that in a second. And it may be that there are some distracting things inside of this temple that need to be cleaned out. Maybe there's some stuff that's distracting and taking away from your worship and your service to God. And it's time for those things to go. Just like what Jesus did. This is a place dedicated to God's service. And if there's other stuff getting in the way of that, making it gross, it's time to run that stuff out. That's number one. Number two, though, this is one that I thought of. In a church setting like this, I'm not being Mr. Critical. Like, you all don't know this. I've only said this probably to a handful of you. When I'm talking up here, I'm looking around. Abby, like I'm looking at you right now because I'm thinking about it. But normally when I'm talking and I'm looking around, I don't have any idea what's going on. An active shooter could walk in this building and I wouldn't have any clue because I'm in a space where I'm talking about all of this stuff. And I'm telling you that because it's not as if I'm looking at you right now thinking this thought, but I know it's true. And it's true about myself. We've come here to worship God, right? We've come here to sing and to pray. And we share the Lord's Supper together. And we open up the Bible and we study. Do you think we could turn our phone off for 45 minutes when we come in to worship God without distractions and texting and checking my messages and what's happening in the world and all of this stuff? It seems like that would be a really good application for this thing too. This is a place devoted to His service and to His worship. Let's not be distracted by the other stuff. Jesus walks into a place where it was for worship, full of distraction, and He said, we got to clean this stuff out. This is what we're going to do here. We're going to worship God. And so maybe in your own life, maybe when you come to church, and something to think about. Okay, next. Chapter 2 and verse 18. John chapter 2 and verse 18. So the Jews said to Him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? That is gross. Their reaction is not reflection. You would think that somebody comes in, whether it's Jesus or not, and says, this is a place devoted to God's worship, and you set up a marketplace to make money. Can we think about this for a second? Their immediate reaction is not to reflect. Rob, your Lord's Supper talk this morning. Jesus looks over at Peter, and his immediate reaction is to reflect. Their immediate reaction is to say, how about some proof? Show us that it's true. Which is just a window into the hearts of the people that we're dealing with here. This is not okay, what's going on. But Jesus says, okay, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And boy, this made some people upset. There's some facts for you. I'm not going to read through them right now, but maybe part of what seemed so ridiculous to them that Jesus was saying this, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up, is that this temple had been under construction for 46 years, and it wouldn't even be finished for about another more than 30 years, before it was ultimately going to be finished. And Jesus says, tear it down, and I'll build a new one in 3 days. And they're looking at Him like this. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. But it's not just that what Jesus said was unbelievable to them. Look at these 4 examples. We're not going to read them. They really got upset about this. When Jesus was before He was hanging on the cross, when Jesus was standing trial, and they were trying to get Him ultimately crucified by the Romans, one of the things that they said was, bring in these witnesses, and the best they could come up with, He said He was going to tear down the temple. They're still hanging on to it. I think that's probably how you know that they were really upset about it, because they were really mad about it. When He was hanging on the cross, they made fun of Him, and they said, oh yeah, you're hanging on the cross. You said you were going to tear the temple down, and 3 days, bring it back. whatever it was about this that Jesus said, he struck a nerve with these people. Look at this one in the Stephen example. In Acts chapter 6 and verses 12 through 14, when Stephen, the thing that provokes Stephen to begin talking to the people who ultimately kill him because he made them so mad, they're still upset about the Jesus guy who said he was going to tear the temple down. And then they're still talking about it even at the end of Acts in Paul's day. This really upset them. But I think that you know this anyway, and you know it from the text because the text tells us what was going on here in verse 21. Jesus was really talking about the temple of his body. How about this? How about we just read 2 of these passages? 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verses 16 and 17. As always, if you want the rest of these passages, just send me a text message and I'll shoot them over to you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verses 16 and 17, Paul says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple?" The temple is a place where God lives. Temple is not just some building that exists on a hill somewhere. A temple is where God dwells. It's a dwelling place of God. And Paul says to the Corinthians, you are that place. You are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. There's another one. Look over at Ephesians chapter 2. In Ephesians chapter 2, you can see this personal sense. Verses 19 to 22. Ephesians 2, starting in verse 19. "So then," speaking to Christians, "you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." So, the household of God, the place where God lives, his household. Built. What's the house built on? It's built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. So, Jesus says to these people, they say, "Give me a sign. You're coming in here, clearing out this place, saying, this is a place where people should be worshiping, and instead you've turned it into a marketplace." And they get mad and they say, "Give us some authority, give us some proof that you have some authority to say these things and to do these things." And Jesus says, "Tear it down, and in 3 days I'm going to build a new one. I'm going to build the place where God really is and where worship really happens." And the place that he was describing is the temple that is the church. And the cool thing about it is you're a brick in the church, and you, and you, and you. And anytime you become a part of God's household, you're a brick into this temple that's growing, that Jesus started after the 3 days in the tomb whenever he was raised from the dead. In 3 days, I will build it up. I like this too. It's something worth thinking about, probably plugging into your mind. On multiple occasions, whenever people came to Jesus and they said, "Show us a sign. We want to see that it's true, that it's real," Jesus just looked them right in the eyes and said, "No. I'm not going to do that." You can read those 2 different passages where he specifically says this. I'm back at Mark chapter 2. I haven't read this yet. In verses 23 through 25, "Now when he was at Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing." Hey, look, Jesus did a sign. We believe in him. Hold on a second. "But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man." This quote articulates what I think I'm trying to get at pretty well. Jesus calls people to trust him for what he is, not because he passes some test that we set up for him. Show us a sign, show us a sign. And Jesus says, no, that's not what I'm here for. You can come to me and be my people on my terms or not. And the ball's in your court. But I think the irony about this whole thing is that Jesus said, I will give you a sign. It's going to be that I'm raised from the dead. And the irony is that the people who wanted a sign are the people who were responsible for his death. And then even after he was raised from the dead, they still didn't believe. So probably it's a window into their heart. That's our text. I think that there's a couple applications that we've looked at, but there is an invitation built in to this story about the cleansing of the temple and what the temple is and how Jesus built it. If you're not a Christian, the great benefit of being one is that you get to be one of these bricks that make up the household of God. The cool thing whenever you're baptized in the name of Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins and you come up out of the water, it's neat in so many ways. My sins have been washed away. I've been born again to walk in newness of life. There's dozens of things that we could talk about with that. But the thing tonight, when you come up out of that watery grave and now you're a Christian, you're one of the bricks in God's house. You make up part of the temple that God dwells in. And it seems to me like something that is devoted to his service and to his worship should be clear and free from all other distractions, but what a great honor to be a part of the household of God. If you want to do that tonight, if you know what you need to do or you want to talk about it, come forward, make your needs known as we stand and sing the invitation song.